So at the moment, we are on Euro 6 emission standards for cars, both for petrol and for diesel. Why is this important to us as consumers, as drivers? Well, because when cities set up clean air zones, so for example, here in London, we have ULEZ, the ultra low emission zone, the largest low emission zone in the world, in any city in the world, in fact, and which was just expanded at the end of last year. You can find out more about that on my blog. The criteria for that is that petrol cars must be Euro 4 and above. That's around 2006 onward. And for diesel cars, it's worse because it also includes particulate emissions as well as nitrogen dioxide emissions. That's Euro 6. So Euro 6 was from about 2015, 2016 onwards. And so this becomes a big issue if you have cars that don't meet those criteria and you live in a city or a place where they have or are going to introduce these emission zones. Now, one of the things about the ULEZ that we have here in London is that people are always like, well, what's going to be the next part of that? Because every couple of years, it either gets extended or maybe the price will go up or something else. So people are like, what's going to happen next? And one of the things that people have speculated is that we know that there's another Euro emission standard coming. So will it be uprated to that? Well, if it gets uprated to that, that's going to be very, very difficult because the Euro 7 emission standard is actually scheduled to be introduced on the 1st of July 2025. So actually only a year and a few months from now. We're in April 2024. And this actually is quite significant because it's not only going to be stricter in one sense, but it's going to be all-encompassing. And what I mean by that is that it will cover not only what we would call tailpipe emissions, but tires, brakes, and electric vehicles. I'll explain right after this.
A brown car guy. Brown car guy.
Right, so this thing will apply to all types of fuels. It's Euro 7 standard when it comes in. All types of fuels, including electric vehicles. One assumes that also means hydrogen and anything else that's out there. So basically it will cover everything. And the reason it will cover everything is because not only does it cover emissions from the tailpipe, like I said, but it looks at other emissions from the vehicles. So the key changes under Euro 7 include the imposition of stricter limits on nitrogen oxides, NOx,
that's right.
and particulate emissions from both the petrol and diesel cars. So this is the other thing. So at the moment, particulate emission was from diesel, not from petrol, but this one says particulate emissions from both petrol and diesel. This is not 100% cast in stone yet. So this is what I've found. It may change, it may, but this is what I've found so far. But like I said, I don't think it's been fully cast in stone yet, and I'll explain why a little bit later on. So what they're doing is they're setting the particulate emissions is 60 milligrams per kilometer. 60 milligrams per kilometer is the limit. So it has to be less than that. And 80 milligrams per kilometer for diesel engines. So what it is currently. That sounds noisy. Kids school. Let's go this way. So 80 milligrams per kilometer for diesel engines is what it is at the moment for Euro 6. So basically there's a drop of 20 milligrams for Euro 7. That's what we're going to see. And Euro 7 will regulate emissions from vehicle components such as brakes and tires, which have not previously been covered by the Euro standards. And this will involve setting limits on the microplastics that come out of tires and also the brake dust that comes out of brakes, right? So for electric vehicles, Euro 7 will also, this is in addition, this is just for electric vehicles. For electric vehicles, Euro 7 will also introduce regulations for battery durability to ensure that they maintain a certain capacity over a set time. So for example, like nowadays, there's been discussion of like 10 years, how much can you still charge an EV battery? Sometimes you lose like as much as 10 to 20% over that time. So you can only charge it to 80% rather than 100%. So what they're going to do is they're going to set a standard for that. So they're going to say it has to be at least this much by this time, whatever that is. the idea is to boost confidence in the longevity and the sustainability of EV batteries. So like I said, at the moment, with internal combustion engine cars, only 15% of the emissions, particular emissions, is actually from the tailpipe, and the rest is from tires and brakes. A study by researchers from the University of Toronto shows that non-tailpipe emissions have surpassed tailpipe emissions since around 2013. So that was a sort of switchover point where basically engines got much cleaner. Engines have actually been getting cleaner since the 1990s. They got significant cleaner. Since around mid-90s, I would say. They've got significantly cleaner than what they were in terms of the emissions from the tailpipe. Which is why it's so staggering that we keep getting penalized for this. But anyway, the shift is largely due to stringent emission standards and advances in vehicle technology, which have greatly reduced the tailpipe pollutants. Yeah, that's what we know. But non-tailpipe sources have now come into focus. So this is the thing. So when they say that, well, where are the emissions on the vehicle coming from? Well, they're not coming from the tailpipe anymore because we've cleaned up the engines. The engines which we now want to get rid of and tell everybody to drive EVs instead. But in fact, they're coming from tires and brakes, which of course EVs also have. This highlights a broader regulatory measures required to address these sources as vehicles continue to evolve. Now, I must just say about EVs that people immediately assume that because they're bigger, well, they tend to be bigger because of the batteries that are in them. They certainly tend to be heavier. Last time I said as much as 50%. I was correct actually. In some cases it was. I mean, as much as, it's not always the case that it's 50% heavier than their equivalents, but in some cases. But you can certainly say, between 15% upwards, for sure they're heavier. I mean, I don't really subscribe to this notion that they're too heavy. I don't agree with that, because some EVs are like, 2,000, 2,500 kilograms. SUVs have been that sort of weight. I'm talking about diesel SUVs. They've been that sort of weight for years now anyway. So I don't think that, this whole discussion that, EVs are out there, they're too heavy, car parks will collapse, roads are falling apart. Well, if car parks are collapsing, that's because of poor construction, in architecture, poor planning. They haven't built them properly. And as for roads, roads are designed to be able to cope with HGVs. Compared to HGVs, cars are nothing. So I don't subscribe to that. Now, but what that does have an impact on the emissions, the non-tailpipe emissions, is that you will get a little bit more tire emissions. So tire wear is a bit more on EVs. Not massively more. We're talking about 5 to 10% more. Different people have different experiences with different cars, depending on driving conditions, etc., etc. But that's a generic sort of term. But a little bit more. But in terms of brake dust, they're actually less. And the reason that they're less is because they have a real advantage there. Because they're running on a motor, and because they have a regen system, which uses the friction of the slowing of the car to generate, like a dynamo, to generate power to charge up the battery. So they are basically more focused on using that to slow down than using the actual brakes. And many EVs have actually got one pedal modes. I see the latest ones, they're getting rid of that, which is unfortunate because I quite like actually our one pedal mode in an EV. But they have one pedal mode, which means basically you don't have to use the brake pedal. So you only ever use it when you're hard braking or emergency braking or whatever. But if you're very careful and you look ahead and you plan your driving properly, then you can pretty much drive around town on the one pedal. You just lift on. It's like driving a remote control car, an RC battery car. You just have the toggle switch. So when you push the toggle switch forward, it's accelerating. When you release the toggle switch, it just stops. So it's like that. So it's the same sort of principle. So they have that situation where they will use the brakes a lot less. In fact, so much less is that the only real maintenance issues that a lot of EVs have been seized brakes because they just haven't been used enough. So a lot of service departments, what they tell owners is like, every now and then, can you go out and actually use the brakes on the car to make sure that they're still working. So that's the only thing. So they have an unfair advantage, you could say, compared to ICE vehicles in the sense that they use they will have less brake dust, but the tire emissions will still be high. So how are they actually going to do this? Euro 7 will implement more vigorous testing procedures that reflect real-world driving conditions. This includes the measurement, as I said, of brake matter released by brake systems and tires. So they'll probably set standards. It's probably also like they'll be working with tire companies as well. Vehicle manufacturers may need to develop and incorporate advanced materials and designs to reduce the wear and tear on brakes. So ceramic brakes, for example, could be one answer, but they tend to be quite expensive. There could be advancements in brake pad and tire composition. There are. I know a lot of tire companies are working on this already. They're also working on tires. So at the moment, you have a situation which, if you didn't know, you should not be using the same tires or that you would use for an ICE car on an EV. The tires for EV are generally specific to EVs because, again, they have the higher weight, but they have to have lower rolling. Often they have low rolling resistance. They have stiffer, stronger sidewalls, etc., etc. So they're different. However, there are some tire companies, such I think as Bridgestone, which are actually now working on tires that will be fine for both vehicles. So tire companies are moving towards this new standardization of tires that I suppose will be low emissions, but also will be standard across EVs and ICE cars as well, which makes sense because otherwise it's just too many tires, right? Euro 7 is expected to include provisions for ongoing monitoring of emissions. This could involve the use of onboard sensors to continuously assess emission levels, ensuring compliance throughout the vehicle's life. Because this is a really interesting thing. It's like how, okay, you could set the standard to start with. You could set it to start with. You could say, right, this car, when it leaves the showroom, has these emissions because we've tested it in laboratory conditions, we've tested the tires, we've tested the brakes, we know what it will be. But how can you then ensure that it will do that? Well, they're talking about putting monitoring systems in these cars, which to me is like, oh, that's very clever, but B, very expensive. And another layer of technological complexity that you're adding to the car. More things to go wrong, in other words, you know. We don't know at the moment, because we don't have the full data set, I guess, or the full specifications of what Euro 7 is, whether there are any EVs at the moment. Also, I guess we don't have the data in terms of tire emissions and brake emissions on current models. So this is the other problem, is that with, unlike, so for example, not so much Euro 6, because that was pretty much a clear cutoff for diesel cars. But Euro 4, for example, well, like I said, Euro 4 mainly on petrol cars applies from around 2006 onwards. But actually, 2005, 2006 onwards, but actually cars as far back as the late 90s do actually comply with those standards because they already were meeting those emission standards. And if there was data, so the only thing is if there's data for them. So when you go back to like the 80s, see, for example, there's no data for my car, which is an 89 car. So there's no way I know whether or not, I mean, to be honest, it's unlikely to meet that requirement, but there's no way that I know for sure because the data wasn't there. Hope you're enjoying this video. If you are, make sure you hit that like button, comment, share, tell the world. Euro 7 will introduce new regulations that are not currently in effect and will include, like I said, the tires and the brakes. Since these standards are set to be enforced from July 2025, manufacturers are still in the process of adapting and preparing for these requirements. So we don't know yet what they are. What we do know, brake emissions. Okay, we know this. Brake emissions for Euro 7. They will start with 7 milligrams per kilometer. This is interesting. This is graduated. So it's not. So this is, again, it's another problem. It's so much complexity, making it so much more difficult for A, the consumer, but B, more importantly, the manufacturer, which of course ultimately is going to add to cost. Because the manufacturer has to keep engineering and remanufacturing and, you know, developing. So here's the thing. For brake emissions, the Euro 7 standards will start with a limit of 7 milligrams per kilometer, which will then be tightened to 3 milligrams per kilometer from 2035. So you have for 10 years, you have 7 milligrams, and you have 3 milligrams. Now the thing is, like, I guess what they're saying there, I guess what they are accounting for there is the fact that by 2035, most cars will be EVs. Most, if not all, new cars being sold will be EVs, because in most European countries, well, in Europe actually was 2035. In the UK was 2030, which was then changed to 2035, which the Labour government will probably change back to 2030. They've already said they will do. So that's what they're doing. So this is part of. So they're saying this because they want to try and reduce particulate emissions from brakes by 27% by 2035. There's a sort of overall target of this sort of thing. So there you go. So that's Euro 7. So that's what's coming. 1st of July, 2025. All cars sold from that point onwards will have to comply to Euro 7 standards, which are not just about emissions from the engine, but actually emissions from the tires and the brakes, which is, I think, a whole level of complexity, which will certainly shoot up the prices of cars. So again, people are trying to put off buying a petrol or diesel, which is even harder to get now, car, because they're thinking, I'll wait till the cutoff of 2030. which it currently probably is going to be, even though I know that Rishi Sunak moved it to 2035, but like I said, it'll probably move back to 2030. So if you're thinking I'll hold off and then I'll buy a petrol car then before I'm not allowed to anymore, but even that petrol car will be more expensive and more stringently monitored in a sense. I don't know how they're going to do this, but there you go. Additional expenses. So cars are going to get more expensive, more complex, more difficult to run and fix. There you go. Let's get your car now. Or invest in a good classic. That's something that's going to last and last and last. Let me know your thoughts on this in the comments below. Check this out, guys. It's my book. It's my first novel, and it's written for car fans like you. It's a fun political action thriller. It's full of cool cars and spectacular action. Get your copy now at Amazon.com.